Welcome to Josie to Lagos. This is an African podcast from Africa for Africa. What we're going to try to do is to provide deep insight, thorough explanation and examination of the African moment and the events that are unfolding in Africa. Why? Because we need this kind of content. We need to be able to deeply probe the African moment as well as that confounding question that still chases Africa at every corner. Why is Africa not performing at her full potential? The Josie to Lagos podcast seeks to examine that and more. And in the weeks to come, in the months to come, and in the years to come, hopefully we can get more clarity on this continent and how to bring it to a position of success. So today we are going to talk about Zimbabwe. Right now, the world is going through this resurgence of attention for the plight of Zimbabwe. A movement known as the ZimbabweanLivesMatter movement is gaining public support, and that's something that is good and valuable. Today, however, we're going to look at the collapse of the Zimbabwean currency specifically. How did this currency collapse? What led to its collapse? Because the failure of Zimbabwe to have its own currency is a large part of the reason why the country is facing the problems that it's facing today. Everything basically fell apart in 1997. There's a day that Zimbabweans have marked as Black Friday, the 14th of November in 1997. This is not the same Black Friday that you may be thinking of, the shopping Black Friday, the one where people are rushing into malls, clawing at each other, pulling each other's weaves out to try to get a preferential position in the line and to try to get into all kinds of tech stores and supermarkets to get the best deal. That's not what this Black Friday indicated or demarcated. Black Friday, as Zimbabweans mark it, the 14th of November 1997, is the day on which the Zimbabwean currency lost 70% of its value against the US dollar. This loss of value caused a flight of foreign capital as the currency was basically dumped by everybody who was holding on to it. Foreign investors, people who were exchanging money, people who do forex trading, they all got rid of the Zimbabwean currency because it was viewed as being worthless. Now, the collapse of the Zimbabwean currency also led to a collapse of the markets, the stock market, the Zimbabwean Stock Exchange. And then it also led to a shortage of foreign capital reserves. So just how did the Zimbabwean currency actually collapse? What brought us to the point where Zimbabwe went through this Black Friday moment? In order to explain that, I want to go back a little bit in time to explain to you the pivotal moments in the liberation struggle for Zimbabwe. And I'm going to do it using Joshua Nkomo, who was one of the most influential leaders of the liberation struggle in Zimbabwe and was one of the founders of the liberation struggle in Zimbabwe. So Joshua Nkomo traveled to South Africa in the year 1942. He spent a period of 5 years in South Africa, and in that time he met young leaders of the African National Youth League, African National Congress Youth League. Namely, he met Nelson Mandela, he met Oliver Tambo, and they deeply influenced his thoughts on liberation struggle, his thoughts on the African moment. And when he traveled back to then Rhodesia, he was a founder of the African National Congress in Rhodesia at the time. That African National Congress got renamed to the Southern Rhodesian African National Congress. And then it then developed into a full political party, which was called the National Democratic Party. That party was banned by the colonial regime in the year 1960 because, if you are not aware, Rhodesia was under the control of Britain at the time as an annexed colony. What then happened is that Joshua Nkomo then formed a new organization, which was then called the Zimbabwean African People's Union, ZAPU. ZAPU was formed in 1961 and Joshua Nkomo was the president. He remained the president of ZAPU basically from the year 1961 up until the year 1987. ZAPU did break up. Basically, the way the Zimbabwean liberation story starts is similar to the way that the story of the West Side, East Side beef in hip hop starts. Tupac and Biggie Smalls were friends. They used to share apartments. They used to support each other's music. But as the hip hop industry grew and as the 90s unfolded, we all know that this ended up in an East Coast, West Coast beef where they both died. So in a similar vein, in 1961, all of the liberation fighters were of one mind and they were all part of ZAPU. However, in 1963, they split up. ZAPU was broken up into two different entities. And those entities were ZAPU and a new entity which was called the Zimbabwean African National Union. So the Zimbabwean African National Union is commonly known as ZANU. So in 1963, you have these two entities, ZAPU, which is being led by Joshua Nkomo, by people such as Lookout Masuku, Jason Ziapapa Moyo, as well as Dumiso Dabengwa. On the ZANU-PF side, you have leaders such as Ndabaningi Sithole, Edgar Tekere, Herbert Chitepo, Robert Gabriel Mugabe, Josiah Tongogara. That was the lineup that existed on the side of ZANU. Critically, it's important to note that at this point, the tensions were not tribal. In fact, the leader of ZAPU in 1963, who was appointed, was actually Ndabaningi Sithole, a person who comes from the Ndebele group of tribes. You must also critically be aware that Ndebele is not really a tribe. It's an amalgamation of tribes. Shona is not really a tribe as well. It's an amalgamation of tribes. So you have Zezurus, for instance, and you have different Shona tribes in the Shona tribal grouping. So at the beginning, the split in 1963 was not a tribal split. It was an ideological split. And that ideological split was on the basis of how should the war be fought, or how should the colonial entity be resisted. Joshua Nkomo, Dumiso Dabengwa, and Lookout Masuku were of the view that it ought to be through a professional military, through a protracted military battle. And the people who formed ZANU were of a more moderate view, where they did not think that there was a need to actually roll out an extensive military operation. Both entities would end up reaching the same conclusion, however, that there was no option but to engage in military warfare. But at the time when the split happened, there was a difference of opinion between Ndabaningi Sithole and Joshua Nkomo factions, and that's what led to the formation of ZAPU and ZANU. In 1964, the Rhodesian Bush War then started. This was a war that lasted from the 4th of July 1964 up until the 12th of December 1979. It was a war that lasted for 15 years, 5 months, 1 week, and 1 day. And in this particular war, you had three entities that were fighting. You had the Rhodesian army that was fighting to defend the colonial structure. And this army was fighting for the Prime Minister Ian Smith. It was fighting for the political party which was known as the Rhodesian Front. The second entity was an entity which was called ZIPRA. ZIPRA stands for the Zimbabwean People's Revolutionary Army. This is an army that was affiliated with ZAPU, the party that was led by Joshua Nkomo. So if you want to remember it, it's ZIP with ZAP. So ZIPRA is with ZAPU. Then there was another army called the Zimbabwean African National Liberation Army. This was ZANLA. This army was affiliated with ZANU. So these are the two armies that were formed, and these were the armies that were fighting the Rhodesian army. So in this war, you had the armies taking different approaches, different strategies, and I'll explain those to you now. It's important to be aware that these armies that were formed, ZIPRA and ZANLA, actually were part of a broader global moment, which was the Cold War. The Cold War was a proxy war between the Soviet Union, the United States of America, China, and other entities based on this ideological dispute around communism/socialism and capitalism. So the Cold War was actually a proxy war because many of the conflicts were fought in different parts of the world and not in direct head-to-head combat. So one of the areas where the proxy wars were fought was in Africa in these types of liberation struggles. So what you see is that ZIPRA got a lot of support from the Soviet Union. They were given tanks, they were given weapons, they were given uniforms, they were trained by Soviet officials, and they were based in the Zambia area and close to Lusaka. Interestingly, they were also working with Umkhonto weSizwe in the Lusaka area as Umkhonto weSizwe was trying to fight the apartheid regime. ZANU and ZANLA, they actually were based in Mozambique, and they received their support from China, from North Korea, from Ethiopia under Mengistu Selassie. Mengistu was actually one of the most brutal killers in the history of Africa, and one day we'll do an episode just on him. And in return for all of the support that Mengistu gave to ZANLA, Mugabe actually offered him amnesty, and Mengistu still lives to this day somewhere in Harare. But Mengistu's story is a story for another day, as I said. So fundamentally, these two entities were fighting in the war against the Rhodesian army. So on the side of ZIPRA, you had Lookout Masuku, who was the commander, Dumiso Dabengwa, who was the head of intelligence, other important actors such as Jason Ziapapa Moyo, who was actually one of the founders of ZIPRA as an entity. On the ZANU side, you had Ndabaningi Sithole, Robert Mugabe, Herbert Chitepo, and the military leaders of ZANLA, with Josiah Tongogara, Solomon Mujuru, and Emerson Mnangagwa was there involved in an intelligence capacity. So in between this war, interestingly enough, most of the political leaders were actually arrested for a period of 10 years, from 1964 to 1974. They were only released in 1974 and then got back and got involved in the liberation struggle directly. However, for 10 years, they were not actively fighting in the war, but they were actually involved in the war to some extent after they had been released in 1974. So the war was fought and the war was won. One is actually the wrong language, because a settlement was reached at Lancaster House, overseen by Lord Carrington. There was this meeting which happened. Lancaster House is the name of the building where it occurred in the United Kingdom, or Britain if you would prefer. And a deal was reached, and Zimbabwe then became an independent state shortly thereafter. So after the war, all of the people who had been fighting for ZIPRA and ZANLA had a challenge that they had to face. Some of them joined the army and some of them went back into civil society. And they had an expectation, and that expectation was that they would be given land and they would be supported by the state. Unfortunately, that did not unfold. For most of the 80s, on the one side, Mugabe was trying to get rid of his political opponents, who he identified as being anybody affiliated with ZIPRA and Joshua Nkomo. That is the reason why there was a mass genocide in Matabeleland called the Kukurahundi, where over 20,000 people were killed. But we will discuss that topic in more detail at a later stage. For most of the 80s, the war veterans were not a priority of the Mugabe regime. Power consolidation was a priority. So in 1989, the war veterans then created what they called the War Veterans League, or Association, if you will. The War Veterans Association was formerly referred to as the Zimbabwean National Liberation War Veterans Association. When it was founded in 1989, it wasn't welcomed by ZANU-PF. It wasn't welcomed by Mugabe. They viewed it as a political threat, but they could not stop it. One of the critical figures in the founding of the War Veterans League, or Association, was Margaret Dongo. And they were very hurtful, a South African word for pissed off. They were very, very unhappy with the treatment that they had received. And so they formed this particular entity, the War Veterans League, this particular entity, the War Veterans Association. And then they started to actually support candidates who were coming from the association, running for positions as members of parliament. Margaret Dongo was one of those, and she became a member of parliament for Harare North at the time. She re-ran as an independent candidate in 1995. Mugabe put a candidate against her. Initially, they had declared that she had lost, but she contested the outcome, and it turned out that she actually won a runoff, not a runoff, a rerun, when the courts ruled in her favor. So Margaret Dongo is an example of the people who are getting critical from the War Veterans Association of Robert Mugabe. Now, that's the context that you need to understand. But I now need to introduce you to an interesting character who enters the scene and really messes up the Zimbabwean currency. His name is Dr. Tshenzherayi Hunzwi. Dr. Tshenzherayi Hunzwi was born in 1949, and his self-acclaimed nickname was Hitler. So he was a very interesting person because in terms of appearance, he used to like to keep either very short hair or to be totally bald-headed. He had an athletic physique, very slim guy, used to have no facial hair whatsoever, very soft-spoken in general. And what was interesting about him is that he actually spent a lot of time in exile. Specifically, he was in Romania and in Poland, and he actually got a medical degree while studying in Poland. He was able to speak 5 languages: Shona, French, English, Polish, and Romanian. So he actually comes into the picture in 1990, just after the formation of the War Veterans Association. When he returned to Zimbabwe, he opened a practice in a township called Budiriro. And what he did in his practice was that he would issue disability declarations for war veterans. So anybody who was a war veteran would come to him, they would get this disability declaration, and the declarations were used to claim large amounts of money from the government. So in issuing these declarations, Hunzwi became one of the most popular people within the War Veterans Association, which he, of course, had joined. And they had their first convention in 1992, and he actually contested for leadership in 1997, and he won by a landslide because he obviously was a guy who was making a lot of people rich within the entity of the War Veterans Association. When he took over the War Veterans Association, he escalated the extent of the rhetoric that was against Robert Mugabe. Basically, he said that Robert Mugabe had betrayed war veterans, that war veterans deserve to be given compensation, they deserve to be given a pension, they deserve to be given land, and he was amping up the rhetoric against Robert Mugabe. And he had a lot of powerful people supporting him, people who were members of the War Veterans Association and other people who had aspirations to get power for themselves. So what then happened is on the 21st of August, Mugabe conceded to the demands of the War Veterans Association. He conceded to give them a lump sum of 50,000 Zimbabwean dollars, which was the equivalent of 2,000 US dollars at the time. He conceded to a lifetime pension. He conceded to give the war veterans free health care. He conceded to give them free education. There were 60,000 registered war veterans at the time, and the cost just of the lump sum payment was actually going to be 2 billion rands, and that was a lot of money. So the World Bank actually started asking questions about where is this money going to come from, and Mugabe actually said that they would borrow if they had to borrow, but that he would have to acquiesce to the demands of the war veterans. The World Bank and the IMF and other lending institutions were not impressed by this, and they actually suspended all of the support that they were giving to Zimbabwe, the financial support that they were giving to Zimbabwe. At the same time that this was happening, on the 5th of November, the new Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Tony Blair, issued a statement through his Secretary for State for International Development, Claire Short. And the extent of that statement was, and this is, I'm reading it now, I'm quoting it. Claire Short sent a letter that said, "I should make it clear that we do not accept that Britain has a special responsibility to meet the costs of land purchase in Zimbabwe. We are a new government from diverse backgrounds without links to the formal colonial interests. My own origins are Irish, and as you know, we were colonized, not colonizers. We do, however, recognize the very real issues you face over land reform, and we believe that land reform could be an important component of a Zimbabwean program designed to eliminate poverty. We would be prepared to support a program of land reform that was part of a poverty eradication strategy, but not on any other basis." This was issued on the 5th of November. So basically, Tony Blair, in issuing this letter, was reneging on the Lancaster House Agreement around land, where Britain had committed to pay 50% of the costs of land. And initially, the model that they wanted was a willing buyer, willing seller. But the ZANU-PF actually moved away from a willing buyer, willing seller model, implementing a Land Acquisition Act in 1992. And then they were now moving to what was called rapid land acquisition. So after the acquiescence to the demands of the war veterans on the 21st of August and the exchanges with the World Bank, the IMF, and after the announcement that the United Kingdom would no longer be supporting the land reform program, what then happened is that many people who were in the farming sector, many people who were in foreign direct investment, many people who were in forex trade, all decided that it was time to get out, because the likelihood was that you were not going to actually get your compensation for the farmland, and that it looked like, things had hit the fan. So basically what happened then on the 14th of November, 1997, is that all of the chickens came home to roost at the same time, and the currency collapsed. And after that, Zimbabwe went into free fall. You know that movie. You've seen what it looks like. There was hyperinflation. There were massive shortages. There were massive protests. And the way that ZANU-PF responded to that was with repression, suppression, and oppression. And that oppression continues up until this day. This is why we have seen that journalists have been arrested for investigative reporting. This is why we've seen that activists have been intimidated and arrested for being activists. This is why we've seen that people in political parties are being frustrated as they try to organize and express their political opinions. Of course, a lot of it is being done right now under the guise of COVID-19, but it's clearly all to maintain the power structure of Zimbabwe. But if you wanted to know how exactly did the Zimbabwean currency collapse, it all happened in 1997, and Tshenzherayi Hunzwi, Dr. Tshenzherayi Hunzwi, who was a self-proclaimed Hitler, had a lot to do with it, and the war veterans had a lot to do with it as well. That's where we're going to end the episode. Thanks so much for listening. This is part 1 of a series on Zimbabwe, which we'll do periodically to bring you up to speed with a topic that is of interest, one of Africa's most confusing stories, and one of Africa's most intriguing stories because of the characters who've been involved in its history. I hope that helps you understand the moment, the history, and what actually led to Zimbabwe not even having a currency to this day. If you want to interact, you can do it. Josie to Lagos is on Twitter. I'm on Facebook. I'm on all of the platforms, so you're more than happy to engage.